Well, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. This is a follow-up to two previous episodes, one on the split of the Carolinas into two states, and then the other one on the split of Virginia into two states, West Virginia and Virginia. And so this is the third part of this series. And tonight we're going to be talking about the split of North and South Dakota, the original Dakota Territory, and why this split took place, and why these two became states in the long run. And we'll talk about that. Just realizing that the Dakota Territory, prior to the Revolutionary War, was a very wild area of the country, not settled at all, mostly Indian tribes, the Sioux being the most powerful, the Dakotas. There were several other big tribes that were inhabiting that area out there. This was the northernmost portion of the Louisiana Purchase, which Thomas Jefferson purchased from Napoleon for $15 million. And it was actually huge deal at the time. It doubled the size of the United States. And the Dakota Territory, this very wild area that had not been settled, was the northernmost portion of this part of the property that the United States had purchased from France. And so we'll go into all the history of the Dakota Territory, how it was settled, what happened over time as the two portions of the state became more and more different, and then why eventually they ended up splitting into two separate states and some of the ramifications of that. So let's go ahead and talk about the split of North and South Dakota. So the Dakota Territory was an organized, incorporated territory of the United States that existed from March 2nd, 1861 until November 2nd, 1889, when the final extent of their now reduced territory was split and admitted to the Union as the states of North and South Dakota. The Dakota Territory consisted of the northernmost part of the land acquired in the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 by Thomas Jefferson's administration, as well as the southernmost part of Rupert's land, which was acquired in 1818 when the boundary was changed to the 49th parallel. The name refers to the Dakota branch of the Sioux tribes, which occupied the area at the time. Most of the Dakota Territory was formerly part of Minnesota and Nebraska territories. When Minnesota became a state in 1858, the leftover area between the Missouri River and Minnesota's western boundary fell unorganized. When the Yankton Treaty was signed later that year, ceding much of what had been Sioux Indian land to the U.S. government, early settlers formed a provisional government in the Dakota Territory and unsuccessfully lobbied the United States for territory status. Wilmot Wood Brookings was the provisional governor of this area. The cities of Wilmot and Brookings, as well as Brookings County, were named for him. 3 years later, President-elect Abraham Lincoln's cousin-in-law, John Blair Smith Todd, personally lobbied for territory status from the U.S. government, and the U.S. Congress formally created the Dakota Territory. It became an organized territory on March 2nd, 1861. Upon creation, the Dakota Territory included much of present-day Montana and Wyoming, as well as all of present-day North and South Dakota, and a small portion of present-day Nebraska. President Lincoln appointed Dakota Territory's first governor, William Jayne, who was Lincoln's old friend and neighbor from Springfield, Illinois. A small patch of land known as Lost Dakota existed as a remote enclave of the Dakota Territory until it became part of Gallatin County, Montana Territory in 1873. All land north of the Kayapah River and a small portion of neighboring Kayapah County was originally part of Dakota Territory, but was transferred to Nebraska in 1882. The Dakota Territory was not directly involved in the American Civil War, but did raise some troops to defend the settlements following the Dakota War of 1862, which triggered hostilities with the Sioux tribes of Dakota Territory. The Department of the Northwest sent expeditions into the Dakota Territory in 1863, 64, and 65. It also established forts in Dakota Territory to protect frontier settlements of the territory, Iowa and Minnesota, and the traffic along the Missouri River. Following the Civil War, hostilities continued with the Sioux until the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. By 1868, creation of new territories reduced the Dakota Territory to the present boundaries of the Dakotas. Territorial counties were defined in 1872, including Bottineau County, Cass County, and many others. During the existence of the organized territory, the population first increased very slowly, and then very rapidly with the Dakota boom from 1870 to 1880. Because the Sioux were considered very hostile and a threat to early settlers, the white population grew very slowly. Gradually, the settlers' population grew, and the Sioux were not considered as much of a severe threat. The population increase can largely be attributed to the growth of the Northern Pacific Railroad. Settlers who came to the Dakota Territory were from other Western territories, as well as many Northern and Western European countries. These included large numbers of Norwegians, Germans, Swedes, and Canadians. Commerce was originally organized around the fur trade. Furs were carried by steamboat along the rivers to the settlements. Gold was discovered in the Black Hills in 1874 and attracted more settlers, setting off the last Sioux War. The population surge increased the demand for meat, spurring expanded cattle ranching on the territory's vast open ranges. With the advent of the railroad, agriculture intensified. Wheat became the territory's main cash crop. Economic hardship hit the territory in the 1880s due to lower wheat prices and a drought. There were two conflicting narratives on why the Dakota Territory was divided and given statehood. One narrative suggests that it was due to regionalist tensions, while other suggestions were that there was a political play by the Gilded Age Republicans. Regionalist tensions between the north and south parts of the territory were present since the beginning. The southern part were always more populated, and the 1880 census, the southern part had a population of 98,268, 2.5 times the northern part of the territory. The southern part also considered the north to be somewhat disreputable, too much controlled by wild folks, cattle ranchers, fur traders, and too frequently the site of conflict with the indigenous populations. The railroad also connected the northern and southern parts to different hubs. The northern part, via Fargo and Bismarck, became closer tied to the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, while the southern part became closer tied to Sioux City and from there, Omaha. Politically, territorial legislatures were appointed by the federal government and tended to remain in a region only when they served their interests. The larger population of the southern region began to resent them, while the northerners tended to emphasize that it was cheaper to be a territory with the federal government funding a wide range of state functions. The territorial governor, Nehemiah G. Ordway, moved the territorial capital from Yankton to Bismarck in 1883. The capital grab, which moved the capital away from the majority of population, fueled more resentment from the south of the north. As the southern part was anxious for statehood so they could have their own capital, had already crossed the 60,000 population necessary for statehood. And so in September 1883, they held a convention where they drafted a state constitution and submitted it to the voters for voting and for referendum. It was approved by the electors and submitted to Congress. A bill providing for statehood of the Dakota Territory south of the 46th parallel of latitude was passed by the Senate in December 1884, but failed to pass the House. A second constitutional convention for South Dakota was held in September 1885. This was 2 years later, framing a new constitution and submitted it to the vote of the people, who ratified it with an overwhelming vote. Conventions favoring division of Dakota into two states were also held in the northern area, one in 1887 in Fargo and another one in 1888 in Jamestown. Both adopted provisions memorializing Congress to divide the territory and admit both North and South Dakota as states of the Union. Various bills were introduced in Congress on the matter, one in 1885 to admit South Dakota as a state and organize the northern half as Lincoln Territory. Another bill introduced in 1886 proposed to admit the entire territory as one single state. Still another provided for the territory east of the Mississippi River to become a single state, the balance to be organized as Lincoln or North Dakota Territory. Other bills were introduced in 1888 and 1889. When full returns of this election came in on January 10, 1888, 37,000 favored division and 32,000 were opposed. In 1889, Republican Benjamin Harrison became president of the United States and favored statehood for Dakota. In order to become a state, the territory was required to have a population of at least 60,000. In 1889, Southern Dakota had a population of 340,000, and North Dakota had a population of over 150,000. So Congress is said to have decided it was finally time to grant statehood. But in reality, the Republican Party, which wanted more power in the U.S. Senate, put on pressure to divide Dakota into two states. With 2 senators from each state, the Republicans would gain 4 more Senate seats in Congress. After defeating Democratic President Grover Cleveland in 1888, they celebrated by splitting the Republican-dominated Dakota into 2 territories and admitting both of them as states. Today, there are still 2 Dakotas because Gilded Age Republicans wanted 4 senators instead of 2. In their eagerness to admit both Dakotas, congressmen also ignored that much of the land in the anticipated state of South Dakota belonged to the Sioux. Perhaps the capital change from Yankton to Bismarck can also be explained by the fact that Yankton was located in southern South Dakota on the territory's border with Nebraska, while Bismarck, whose community had recently grown due to arrival of Transcontinental Railway, had relatively better central location near the Black Hills of South Dakota, where recent gold discovery had a great impetus for growth. Yankton's status as an important port was literally crushed on March 27, 1881, when an ice dam on the Missouri River burst, sending flooding waters and giant blocks of ice flowing towards the town. The resulting floodwaters continued to accumulate behind the debris, and by March 29th, the town's riverfront and downtown were covered in water, ice, and rock, destroying or stranding several riverboats that were moored there. As a result of this flood and the expansion of railroads as a preferred method of shipping goods, Yankton's river boat traffic was reduced, and the city's role as a prominent stopping point on the way west dwindled over the years. It was also not especially unusual for the party that controls Congress to admit states for political reasons. In 1864, Republican Abraham Lincoln signed legislation admitting Nevada, a barely populated desert state with a few thousand residents, into the Union as a state. The few people who did live there were overwhelmingly Republican. A dozen years later, President Ulysses Grant, also a Republican, signed legislation admitting Republican-dominated Colorado as a state, even though, according to the then latest census, Colorado had fewer than 40,000 residents at the time. Republicans also successfully blocked New Mexico from becoming a state until 1912, when Cleveland's Democrats had hoped to admit New Mexico as it would have favored them. The admission of the new Western states was a party political battleground, and each party looking at how the proposed new states were likely to vote. At the beginning of 1888, the Democrats, under President Grover Cleveland, proposed that the 4 territories of Montana, New Mexico, Dakota, and Washington should all be admitted together for balance. The first 2 are expected to vote Democrat, and the latter 2 are expected to vote Republican. So this was seen as a compromise acceptable to both parties. However, the Republicans won majorities in both the House and Senate that year, and to head off the possibility that Congress might admit Republican territories to statehood, the Democrats agreed to a less favorable deal in which Dakota was divided into 2 and New Mexico was left out altogether. Cleveland signed into law on February 22, 1889, that the territories could become states 9 months after that. There had been previous attempts to open up the territory, but these had been foundered because of the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 with the Sioux, and that required 75% of the Sioux adult males on the reservation had to agree to any treaty change. Most recently, a commission headed by Richard Henry Pratt in 1888 had completely failed to get the necessary signatures in the face of opposition from Sioux leaders. The government believed that the Dawes Act of 1887, which attempted to move the Indians from hunting to farming, in theory meant that they needed less land, but at least half of it was for sale at the time. Congress approved an offer for $1.25 per acre for reservation land and $25,000 to induce Indians to sign the contract. A new commission was appointed in April 1889 that included veteran Indian fighter General George Crook. Crook pulled out all the stops to get the Indians to sign using many underhanded tactics. He threatened them that if they did not sign, the land would be taken away and they would get nothing. This would not have been seen as an idle threat. The treaty had been ignored in the past when the Black Hills were taken from the Sioux. Crook ignored leaders like Sitting Bull and Red Cloud, who were opposed to the sale, and kept them out of negotiations, preferring instead to deal with moderate leaders such as American Horse. American Horse, however, claimed immediately afterwards that he had been tricked into signing. Crook made many personal promises which he had no authority to make or keep. On February 22, 1889, outgoing President Cleveland signed an omnibus bill that divided the Treaty of Dakota in half. North Dakota and South Dakota became states simultaneously on November 2, 1889. President Harrison had the papers shuffled to obscure which one was signed first, and the order went unrecorded. The bill enabled the people in the new territories of North Dakota and South Dakota, as well as other territories like Montana and Washington, to write state constitutions and elect state governments. The 4 new states would be admitted into the Union within 9 months. The plan cut Democratic New Mexico out of statehood and split Republican Dakota into the 2 Republican states. Rather than 2 new Republican states and 2 Democratic states the Congress had considered the previous year, the omnibus bill created 3 new Republican states and 1 new Democratic state that Republicans thought they could capture in the future. So really interesting there, as you saw, the amount of politics that was going into effect here and the amount of politics that was playing a role into the split of the Dakotas. So unlike the Carolinas and Virginia, which was much more about slavery and economics and plantation life versus blue-collar life and many other factors, that really was not the case here. This was more about the Republicans who were in charge at the time wanted to split the state into 2 to generate more political power for themselves in Washington, D.C. There were some reasons why the Dakotas and the people who lived in the South and the North also wanted to split. So it wasn't just Washington politicians, but there were individuals who in the Dakotas felt like a split would make sense as well. Let's go ahead and take a look at a short video, and we will come back and talk about it on the other side.
Do we really need 2 Dakotas? North and South Dakota are the butt of more than a few jokes for being quiet, uninteresting corners of the U.S. But really, why are there 2 Dakotas? It's a story of trains, the Great Plains, and one of the stupidest loopholes in American political history that led to these states joining the Union together in 1889. The Dakota Territory has gone through a lot of changes since it was acquired by the U.S. through the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. The first European settlers did not arrive until 1812, when mostly Scottish settlers from Canada founded the settlement of Pembina. More land was acquired with the Treaty of 1818 signed with Great Britain that agreed to split territory west of the Great Lakes along the 49th parallel. Over the years, territory making up the modern Dakotas ended up as part of the territories of Michigan, Minnesota, Nebraska, and finally Wisconsin. Following Wisconsin's admission as a state, the remaining land was organized into the Dakota Territory in 1861. A few more pieces were shaved off over the next few years, Idaho in 1863 and Wyoming in 1868, to finally leave the Dakota Territory that makes up both states today. The future Dakotas had long been inhabited by many Native American groups that roamed the Great Plain. By the time the U.S. moved in, the Sioux predominated. They'd moved into the area in the 16th and 17th centuries after conflict with other native groups farther east. The name Dakota came from them and means friend or ally, but the relationship between the Sioux and the settlers was anything but that. The Sioux lived nomadic or semi-nomadic lives and weren't considered particularly civilized by settler standards, and their claims to the land weren't taken seriously. This led to conflict and forced resettlement as European settlers muscled in. In 1858, the Yankton Treaty saw the U.S. seize large areas of South Dakota for settlement, while many thousands of Sioux were forced into reservations. Further conflicts like the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 and treaties such as the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie further reduced Sioux territory until they were confined only to the far west. Removing the Sioux cleared the way for white settlers who steadily trickled into the territory. The Homestead Act of 1862, which promised 160 acres of land to any settler, offered plenty of incentive to new settlers. As if that wasn't enough, in 1874, an expedition led by General Custer discovered gold in the Black Hills, which led to a small gold rush in the mid to late 1870s that brought in tens of thousands more settlers. As settlers and prospectors moved into the ever-shrinking Sioux territory, they provoked the Great Sioux War that ended in May 1877 with the full annexation of the Black Hills and the elimination of Sioux land in the Dakota Territory. By 1880, the Dakota Territory had around 100,000 people, but a clear divide was emerging. About 2/3 of those people lived in the south, and less than half as many lived in the north. The culture and economy of these two Dakotas was sharply different. The north was largely rural and agricultural. Dominant industries included wheat farming, cattle rearing, and fur trading. Meanwhile, the South was more urbanized and industrialized, concentrating around a handful of more dense urban centers. The South also had the capital, Yankton, nestled in the far southeast corner of the state along the Missouri River. Inevitably, different cultures and attitudes emerged. The North began seeing the South as out of touch and distant with their faraway capital, while the South saw the North as a bunch of rural barbarians who spent too much time picking fights with the Indians. An unlikely factor was at the heart of the divide: the railways. Railways followed the path of migration across the continent. That is, they went east to west, not north to south. Both North and South Dakota were linked to the eastern U.S. by rail, but not with each other, and to separate cities and networks in the east at that. North Dakota connected to Minneapolis via Fargo, while South Dakota connected to Chicago, and from there other cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and St. Louis through its major rail hub at Sioux Falls. All the while, not a single train connected North Dakota to South Dakota. This meant that everything from trade and the economy to the movement of information, cultures, and settlers followed separate routes. There was very little to bind Dakota together, and by the 1880s, they were effectively two societies with separate cultures, economies, and connections to the rest of the United States. The issue that blew the divide wide open was the capital city. Yankton had served as the territory's capital since its inception. It was easily accessed by rail from the east and sat on the Missouri River. But it was about as far away from North Dakotans as a capital could be. Disaster struck Yankton in early 1881 when massive flooding caused by an especially snowy winter wrecked the town, demolishing buildings and decimating the river port. It took weeks for the floodwaters to recede, but Yankton would never fully recover. A new capital was obviously needed. Governor Nehemiah Ordway set about finding one. Multiple cities made a bid, but the clear favorite was Bismarck in North Dakota. It was a lot more central to the state and would be easier for people to access. However, the choice was stained by corruption charges. Bismarck happened to be a major railway hub, and several members of the commission to select a new capital, along with many of Governor Ordway's advisors, just happened to be deeply involved with the railway industry and stood to make a lot of money in extra traffic and land value if Bismarck became the capital. The blatant corruption and the prospect of losing the capital angered South Dakotans, who rallied to block the move. In 1883, they tried to block the change by getting an injunction preventing the governor from holding the legally required meetings about the decision in the old capital of Yankton. Fortunately for Ordway, his railway friends had a little loophole to get around that. Ordway and his allies hopped onto a train, pulled into the Yankton station, held the meeting to confirm the move to Bismarck, and then left. Since they had technically held the meeting in Yankton, the move was approved. South Dakotans were not amused. They wrote to Washington and did manage to get Governor Ordway dismissed on corruption charges in 1884, but the move to Bismarck was already a done deal. Deeply unhappy with the shift in power, residents of South Dakota decided that enough was enough. In 1884, they formed the Dakotan Citizens League, drew up a state constitution, and petitioned Congress to allow them to join the Union as a separate state. Congress shot them down. They were told to either join as one united Dakota or wait for North Dakota to meet the 60,000 population threshold to be a state of its own as well. The South Dakotans chose to wait. After all, Dakota's population had doubled between 1879 and 1884 alone and was continuing to rise. It would only be a few years to wait. The North made its own preparations, holding conventions in 1887 and 1888 to outline its state constitution. Still, there might not have been two Dakotas. The Northerners considered a few other names as well. Pembina, after the original settlement, or Lincoln after the deceased president were considered. In the end, though, they decided that the Dakota name had become a valuable asset for their trading goods, and it wasn't worth the effort to change it. By 1888, with the North soaring over the population threshold, President Grover Cleveland threw one more obstacle in the way. Seeking a compromise involving multiple territories applying for statehood, he proposed admitting a unified Dakota alongside Montana, New Mexico, and Washington. Dakota and Washington were expected to go Republican, the other two Democrat, so it would preserve the balance of power in the Senate. The plan fell through when the 1888 elections saw Republicans seize both the House of Congress and the presidency under Benjamin Harrison. A new deal was struck to allow the admission of both Dakotas, Washington, and Montana, giving 3 new Republican states for the Democrats 1. On November 2, 1889, President Harrison signs the bills approving the admission of North and South Dakota. However, he made sure to mix them up and cover their titles when he signed them so no one would know which Dakota was admitted first. They became the 39th and 40th U.S. states, but to this day, no one knows which is which, and the Dakota Twins are the only 2 states who are officially listed as joining simultaneously. They might not be the most interesting states in the nation, but they'll always have that unique achievement to their name.
You can see from that video there, really fascinating that both states were admitted simultaneously, and they're the only states to have done so, mainly because Harrison covered up their titles when he was signing them to make sure that neither one felt like they were superior to the other, or that neither one felt like they were admitted to the Union before the other. So really fascinating piece of history there. And then if you look back at that video all the way back to the beginning, where it was an unorganized territory, it was mainly dominated by the Sioux and the Dakota tribe of the Sioux. And then you started seeing settlers come in and settle mostly in the South at first, around that Yankton port, which became the capital of South Dakota later on. And you saw the territory continue to scale down as other states were formed. Portions of Dakota's territory became parts of Wisconsin. Portions of it became parts of Nebraska. Then later on, pieces of it got peeled off for Idaho and Wyoming, two new states there. And then eventually Montana as well. And then finally, you got the borders of what was the Dakota Territory, which was the last one to be admitted and split into two separate states, as you saw. And similar to our Carolina episode and our Virginia episode, the Dakota split here made a lot of sense for many different reasons. You saw in the video there talking about the different economies on both sides, one being more rural, one being more industrialized. You had the two sets of railroad networks. The one from North Dakota, of course, went through Wisconsin and Michigan. The one in South Dakota went through Chicago and St. Louis. And so they really had different economies, different states they were interacting with, different states they were trading with. Their cultures were different, their religions were different, and really their people and settlers were different. And so the inevitable split among the states was going to happen, whether it happened as it got admitted to states or whether it was going to happen a little bit later when the two Dakotas couldn't work together anymore. The final straw, as you saw, was over the capital, whether it was going to be in Yankton or Bismarck. And you had a very powerful governor and his very powerful allies who were very much for taking the train network coast to coast and were very wealthy and had a lot of power. And they were very much behind his idea of having Bismarck, which was right in the center of the Dakota Territory, be the new capital of the Dakotas. And then later, of course, became the capital of North Dakota. So hopefully you found that interesting about the split of North and South Dakota, the history behind it, the reasons behind it, as they got formed and all the different impacts that came out of that, and that you'll want to dig in some more into all of the split state series that we've gone through in these three different split states. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have a lot of great content coming your way. We hope you love history as much as we do, and we look forward to seeing you on another episode of Traveling Through History. Have a great evening.